The basic thesis, of course, of the book is that in this contemporary period, the most important distinctions among peoples are not ideological, political, or economic. They are cultural. In my study at home, I have a thick stack of articles, newspaper clippings, reports, other documents, each one of which deals with a different country, with Japan, China, Germany, Russia, Turkey, India, Pakistan, France, Britain, the United States, others. The thesis of each of these articles is that the particular country it is concerned with is in the midst of a major crisis of identity. The world seems to be in a global crisis of identity. Everywhere, peoples and nations are attempting to answer the most basic question humans can face. Who are we? And they are answering that question in the traditional way that humans have answered it, by reference to the things that mean most to them. People define themselves in terms of ancestry, religion, language, history, values, customs, institutions. They identify with cultural groups, tribes, ethnic groups, religious communities, nations, and at the broadest level, I would argue, civilizations. Nation-states obviously remain the principal and most powerful actors in world affairs. Their behavior will be shaped now, as it has been in the past, by the pursuit of power and wealth. But it is also shaped by cultural preferences, commonalities, and differences. States are less likely to see threats coming from states with which they are culturally similar than they are to see threats coming from states that are culturally different. States and peoples who share in a common culture find it easier to cooperate and to trust each other. Global politics, as a result, is being reconfigured along cultural and civilizational lines. This development, it seems to me, has 5 major implications. 1, for the first time in history, global politics is both multipolar and multi-civilizational. During most of human existence, contacts between civilizations were intermittent or non-existent. Then with the beginning of the modern era, about 1500 AD, global politics took on 2 dimensions. For over 400 years, the nation-states of the West, Britain, France, Spain, Austria, Prussia, Germany, the United States, others, constituted a multipolar international system within Western civilization and regularly interacted, competed, and fought wars with each other. At the same time, Western nations also expanded, conquered, colonized, or decisively influenced every other civilization. And that was the pattern for 300 or 400 years. Then during the Cold War, power was divided between the West, the free world on the one hand, and the Soviet Union, which had appropriated, altered, and used a Western ideology to challenge the West in a struggle for global domination. Most of that struggle took place in the Third World. The post-Cold War world is more complex. The most important groupings of states are no longer obviously the 3 blocks of the Cold War, but rather, I would argue, the world's 7 or 8 major civilizations. In his book entitled Diplomacy, that was published last year, Henry Kissinger argues, and I quote him, the international system of the 21st century will contain at least 6 major powers: the United States, Europe, China, Japan, Russia, and India. Kissinger's 6 major powers belong to 5 very different civilizations. And in addition, there are important Islamic states whose strategic locations, large populations, and/or oil resources make them influential in world affairs. At the present time, the 8 largest countries in terms of population belong to 8 different civilizations. The countries with the 7 largest economies belong to 5 different civilizations, and in a decade or two, by plausible projections, the 5 largest economies in the world will belong to 5 different civilizations. In this emerging world, local politics is the politics of ethnicity. Global politics, clearly, is the politics of civilizations. Global politics clearly has become both multipolar and multi-civilizational, and the rivalry of the superpowers is in some measure replaced by the clash of civilizations. Second, a significant shift is underway in the relative power of civilizations and their leading or core states. The West has been the overwhelmingly dominant civilization for centuries and will continue to be that quite definitely well into the next century. Nonetheless, major forces are at work producing changes in relative power. These include the demographic stagnation and relative economic slowdown of the West on the one hand, and the economic dynamism of East Asian societies and the demographic dynamism of Islamic societies on the other. These shifts lead the people in these other societies to have increasing confidence in their own values, cultures, and institutions, and increasingly to disparage those of the West. It may or may not be true that so-called Confucian culture is the source of the recent dramatic economic development of East Asian countries. I have my doubts about that. The important point, however, is that East Asians now believe that to be true. And they believe that they have achieved their economic growth not by importing Western culture, but by adhering to their own. And that hence other people who wish to develop economically should adopt their culture. For years, we Westerners have believed and have in our culture and have promoted our culture as the appropriate universal culture for the world. Last year, in a rather neat reversal of roles, at the meeting of the heads of government from European countries and East Asian countries, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia got up and told Kohl and Chirac and Major and their colleagues that, and I quote him now, European values are European values, Asian values are universal values. In addition to this, one of the most significant developments culturally and politically in recent days clearly is the Islamic resurgence, which has swept across the Muslim world and affected major aspects of life in every Muslim country from Morocco to Indonesia. With one exception, I think it is fair to say, every Muslim country is now more Islamic and Islamist in its outlook, behavior, and institutions than it was 15 years ago. The one exception would be Iran. But this rededication to Islamic culture also very explicitly involves the rejection of Western culture. As people begin to develop a sense of power and of confidence, they put more and more trust in what they view as their own values and beliefs and way of life, and they see virtue in those as a result of their economic and, in some cases, political success. Third point. In this new world, the relations between states from different civilizations will normally be distant and cool and often highly antagonistic. While ad hoc coalitions may exist from time to time between states of different civilizations, These relations are much more likely, I believe, to be described by such terms as competitive coexistence, Cold War, and Cold Peace. The term Cold War, La Guerra Fria, it is interesting to note, was invented by 13th century Spaniards to describe their relations at that time with their Muslim neighbors. And the world now is likely to be a world of several Cold Wars. The most important axis in world politics, however, will be the relations between the West and the rest, as the West attempts to impose its values and culture on other societies despite its declining ability to do so. The relations of the West with what I would call the challenger civilizations, that is, Islam and China, are likely to be particularly difficult and antagonistic. Already we can see a wide range of issues running from nuclear proliferation to human rights to economic and trade issues and a variety of other issues which come up in the dealings between the West and these other civilizations. And with Islam, of course, there is also the questions of terrorism, of Western military intervention in Islamic affairs, and of migration, which is a major issue in many countries in Europe. Most importantly, however, in terms of the relations between the West and Islam and China, is the question of who will shape the nature of global politics and global institutions in the coming century. Who will exercise power? If the economic development of China continues at the same rate for another decade or two that it has had during the past 2 decades, China will become an increasingly powerful country and undoubtedly will attempt to assert its traditional hegemony in East Asia. In fact, in some respects, it is already doing that. This will present the real problems to other East Asian societies, as well as to the United States, which historically has always opposed the domination of either East Asia or Europe by a single power. Indeed, we have fought 2 world wars and 1 Cold War to prevent that from happening in this century. I am not necessarily saying that there will be another war of that sort, but I think this is the rise of China will be a major problem for policymakers throughout the world. And in these conflicts, it clearly will be in the interests of the West to attempt to align with itself the core states of what I would call the swing civilizations, that is, Russia, Japan, and India. Fourth, conflict among ethnic groups is obviously pervasive within civilizations. Ethnic conflict only becomes dangerous to world peace, however, when it involves groups from different civilizations. The bloody clash of clans in Somalia had no consequences for anyone outside Somalia. The bloody clash of tribes in Rwanda and Burundi has had disastrous consequences for Zaire, Uganda, and Tanzania, but not much further. The bloody clashes of civilizations in the Balkans, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the subcontinent, not to mention the Middle East, are dangerous precisely because they could become bigger wars and involve other states. They are the conflicts which demand and usually get the attention of the UN Secretary General and of our Secretary of State. In many respects, the wars that have gone on in the past few years in the former Yugoslavia are classic fault line wars between civilizations. In those wars, the Catholic countries of Europe and Latin America provided substantial support to Slovenia and Croatia. Russia and Greece gave material diplomatic and military help to the Serbs. Islamic countries, most notably Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Malaysia, provided hundreds of millions of dollars and very substantial military equipment to the Bosnian Muslims. Why? Clearly not for reasons of power politics or economic interest or political ideology, but because of cultural affinity. These fault line wars by local groups along the line separating civilizations are not randomly distributed. They are far more likely to involve Muslims fighting non-Muslims than anyone else. In my article 3 years ago, I used the phrase, the bloody borders of Islam, and that phrase certainly stirred up more vigorous and vitriolic criticism than anything else in that article. What that phrase described, perhaps a little bit too dramatically, however, is a fact of contemporary life. And my book lays out massive statistical evidence from a variety of impartial sources that shows it to be a fact. The evidence demonstrates that, in addition, Islam's interior is bloody, because Muslims at the present time fight each other far more often than people of other civilizations fight each other. And I'm not arguing that there is any tendency towards violence inherent in Islam or in Muslims, and I'm not saying that this condition has existed throughout history. I believe, in all probability, if one went back through the centuries, one would probably find that Christians have been more bloody-minded than anybody else. But at the present time, that is not the case, and violence is something which seems to be associated with Islam. The interesting question is, why should this be the case? And I do try to provide a few answers to it in the book, focusing, among other things, on the demographic youth bulge in Muslim countries, where you have a very large proportion of the population between the ages of 15 and 25, and on the fact that, unlike most of the other major civilizations, Islam does not have a one or two dominant core states. Instead, you have the competition for leadership in Islam involving Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, and perhaps others. Fifth, while differences in culture and civilization divide people, cultural similarities bring people together and promote trust and cooperation. As we all know, many efforts at regional economic integration are going on in the world. The relative success of these efforts varies almost directly with the extent to which the countries involved have a common culture. Throughout the world, countries are regrouping politically also along cultural lines. Countries divided by ideology but united by culture are coming together, as the two Germanys have, and as the two Koreas and the several Chinas are beginning to. Increasingly, people and governments talk of cultural communities transcending state boundaries. A greater Serbia, a greater China, a greater Turkey, a greater Russia with its nearer broad, a greater Hungary. Western institutions, including the European Union and NATO, are moving to expand their membership to include those countries which historically have been considered part of Western civilization. Russia is grouping about itself the states that share its Orthodox heritage. In East Asia, economic integration is underway, but it is not, as many expected, an economic integration centered on Japan, which is all alone as a civilization unto itself, but an economic integration rooted in China and the Chinese business communities that dominate the economies of all East Asian countries except Japan and Korea. Nowhere is this cultural reconfiguration of politics more dramatic than in Europe. For 45 years, the critical dividing line in Europe, of course, was the Iron Curtain. Now that line has moved several hundred miles east, and it is the line separating the peoples of Western Christianity on the one hand from Muslim and Orthodox peoples on the other. Austria, Sweden, and Finland, countries culturally part of the West, which had to be neutral and separated from the West in the Cold War, are joining their cultural kin in the European Union. Behind them, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic are moving towards membership in the Union and in NATO as well. In the Baltic, the formerly captive republics are now able to align themselves with their cultural kin in the West, and Sweden, whose foreign policy was frozen into third world do-goodism in the Cold War, has developed an activist policy as a regional leader and a magnet for the Baltic republics. In the Balkans, during the Cold War, Greece and Turkey were in NATO, Bulgaria and Romania were in the Warsaw Pact, Yugoslavia was non-aligned, and Albania was an isolated, occasional friend of communist China. Now, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece have come together in what they refer to as an Orthodox Entente. Slovenia and Croatia are moving toward integration with Western Europe. Turkey is resuming its historic role as the helper and protector of Albanian and Bosnian Muslims. The old antagonism between Greece and Turkey, suppressed during the Cold War by their shared fear of the Soviet Union and communism, is reviving. And indeed, we have seen its revival in recent days by the controversy over the purchase by the Greek Cyprus government of missiles from Russia, to which Turkey has vigorously objected. And in many respects, Greece is developing very close ties with Russia, becoming almost as much an ally of Russia as it is an ally of its fellow members in NATO. Turkey's prime minister belongs to a party with the declared objective of taking Turkey out of NATO, and made his first foreign visits, not to Washington or to Brussels, but to several Muslim countries. Cultural connections and divisions are replacing the ideological and political divisions of the Cold War. Now, people, in conclusion, sometimes accuse me of creating what is referred to as a self-fulfilling prophecy. They say that because I have identified, described, and called attention to clashes of civilizations, this will make people more eager to engage in them. No prophecy, however, is in itself either self-fulfilling or non-self-fulfilling. It depends upon what people do. And in the past, I must say, I have when I have made predictions, I have not been aware of great masses of people rushing out to validate them. In the 1950s and 1960s, many very serious and well-informed people predicted that nuclear war was virtually inevitable. That war did not come about because people became aware of this possibility and took steps to prevent it from materializing. The question now is, it seems to me, how can we prevent local fault line wars and core state conflicts from escalating into major wars of civilizations? It is first necessary, I believe, to recognize and to accept the extent to which global politics is indeed being shaped by cultural factors. During the Cold War, what order there was the product of superpower dominance of their two blocs and superpower influence in the third world. In the emerging world, global power is fading. Global community is a distant dream. Neither the United States nor the United Nations can impose order on a global basis. The components of order in today's more complex and heterogeneous world are found within and between civilizations. The world will be ordered on the basis of civilizations or not at all. In this world, the core states, the leading states of civilization, will take the place of superpowers. They are the sources of order within civilizations and through negotiations with other core states between civilizations. Now you might say, isn't this basically a world of spheres of influence? And it is. But it is also a world in which the exercise of influence by the core state is tempered and moderated by the common culture it shares with the member states of its civilization. Cultural commonality legitimates the leadership and order-imposing role of the core state for both members and for external powers and institutions. In a way, a civilization is like an extended family. And like older members of a family, core states can provide their relatives with guidance and support at times, but also they can impose restraint and discipline at times. Cultural kinship is central to the ability of a more powerful state to reserve conflicts in and impose order on its region, and to negotiate the resolution of intercivilizational conflicts with the core states of other civilizations. Hence, in this emerging world, while the clash of civilizations is the greatest threat to world peace, an international order based on civilizations is the surest safeguard against world war. Thank you.